AITA for calling my friend a creepy weirdo after she posted a TikTok about my husband? Friendships can be funny things. They start in unexpected ways, grow through shared moments, and take root before you even realize it. That's exactly how things had been with June. We met a little over 2 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. And something just clicked. She was bubbly, outgoing, and had this infectious energy that made you feel instantly comfortable around her. By the end of the night, she'd already invited me and my husband to join her and her boyfriend for a weekend trip upstate. It felt impulsive, even strange to make such quick plans. But that was just June, always pulling people into her orbit. June and I quickly grew close, and it wasn't long before our lives started overlapping in all sorts of ways. My husband, an orthodontist, bonded well with her boyfriend, and we started hanging out regularly. Double dates became part of our routine. Dinners, movie nights, little road trips. We'd spend weekends hiking or hitting wineries, even staying over at each other's places when our days went long. We shared stories, confided in each other, and over time, I really came to see her as one of my closest friends. It was a friendship that had simply become part of my life. Like one of those unexpected things you can't imagine being without. But June was different from my other friends. While I leaned toward privacy and was fairly low-key, she was out there, constantly filming. Always on social media, snapping photos, sharing snippets of her life with her followers. Her content was small-scale, sure, but she put a lot of energy into it, calling herself an aspiring influencer. Her Instagram was full of shots from our outings, strategically edited with filters and captions, crafted to look like an ideal, photogenic life. Sometimes it was flattering to be part of her little world, like I'd get to peek into something I didn't usually care about. But other times, it felt a bit invasive. My husband and I had talked about it and decided that while we were happy to be friends with her, we weren't comfortable with being on her social media. We're both pretty private people. He's got a steady stream of patients, and he values the separation between his personal and professional life. I work mostly in an office, and I don't like the idea of my private life being online. I told her up front that I wasn't comfortable being in her vlogs or having photos of me posted online. And she'd agreed, saying she understood. It had even felt like a relief. She'd listened. And I thought that would be the end of it. Despite her outgoing nature, June seemed to respect that boundary. Or at least, I thought she did. We'd see her take little videos here and there, laughing and chatting, but she never seemed to include us in anything she posted. She even reassured me, saying, "I'd never post anything you're not okay with. You can trust me." And so, I did. Maybe that was naive, but at the time, I had no reason to think otherwise. After all, she was my friend, and friends respect each other's boundaries, right? It wasn't until recently, though, that I started seeing another side of June. Something a bit more possessive? I'm not sure if that's even the right word, but I started noticing little things that made me pause. Small hints that maybe she was paying a bit more attention to my husband than seemed typical. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but once I started seeing it, I couldn't unsee it. She'd compliment him on things I'd never even think to comment on. Mentioning his hair, his outfit, even his laugh. It was usually harmless, and he didn't seem to pick up on it, but it planted a seed of doubt in my mind. One day, June even dropped a casual comment about how lucky I was to have a husband like him. A remark that lingered longer than I expected it to. My husband brushed it off, saying she was just friendly, and I tried to do the same. But it stuck with me. In hindsight, I realized that was probably the first red flag. The first sign that June might have been crossing an unspoken line. The funny thing is, it never occurred to me to mention it to her. I think part of me was just afraid of ruining the friendship. We'd grown close, and confronting her would feel like puncturing this perfect bubble we'd created. Instead, I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd laugh off her compliments, tell myself she was just a little eccentric, and move on. It seemed like the easiest way to handle it. Then, June's half-sister, Raya, became one of my husband's patients. Raya was 12, a sweet kid who'd just started her braces treatment. June would usually bring her to appointments since she was the closest family member in town. My husband never minded, of course. He's a professional, and his focus was always on his patients. But something about June showing up for every appointment, tagging along and hovering in the background, felt odd to me. I remember asking my husband about it, and he'd simply shrugged, saying, "She's probably just trying to support her sister." I shrugged it off, too, thinking maybe I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. And then, one day, June started acting like Raya's appointments were just another part of her influencer content. She'd occasionally snap a quick photo outside the office or talk about taking her little sister to get her braces tightened. At the time, I saw it as a quirk, a harmless addition to her social media feed. But that was the thing about June. She always had her phone out. She was always recording, filming, posting, commenting. Every moment was an opportunity for content. There were times I'd look over and catch her with her phone pointed toward us, filming without saying a word. Sometimes she'd look down and smile at something on her screen, like she'd just captured the most brilliant moment. It made me wonder if her constant documentation had less to do with her brand, and more to do with something deeper. Still, I kept my concerns to myself. I'd made it clear that I didn't want to be on her social media. And I trusted her to respect that. But trust, as I would come to realize, was the first misstep I made. It was a Saturday morning when everything changed. My brother texted me with a link to a TikTok video and a message, "Dude, you've gotta see this." I clicked on it, not knowing what to expect. And that's when I saw it, a video June had made. It was a compilation of short clips, set to some trendy background music, with the title, "God, I See What You've Done for Others." The video had hundreds of thousands of views, far beyond her usual reach. And the star of the video? My husband. My stomach dropped. The video was a creepy montage of clips of him that I had never known she'd taken. There were clips from our double dates, weekend trips, even from Raya's appointments at his office. It was clear he had no idea she was filming. The way he'd smile, laugh, or just sit there, oblivious to the camera. One clip even had her face in the foreground, looking cutesy, before panning the camera to him, as though she was silently gushing over him. The worst clip, though, was of my husband in his scrubs, leaning over to adjust Raya's braces. June had filmed the entire thing, zooming in on him, and Raya's face was completely visible in the frame. My heart pounded as I watched. Horrified, not only had she filmed my husband without permission, but she'd exposed a child, a patient, in a way that was completely inappropriate. I could feel my anger and horror building, a tight knot forming in my chest as I processed what I'd just seen. How could she do this? How could someone who called themselves my friend post something so invasive? So downright creepy? In that moment, I knew our friendship had changed, irreversibly and completely. Seeing that video felt like a gut punch. I watched it over and over, each replay only deepening the sense of violation. The first time, I'd been in shock, unable to process the full scale of what June had done. But on the second viewing, I began noticing every uncomfortable detail, the way she lingered on his face, how she'd set the entire thing to music that was far too suggestive, even the way she'd labeled it with a title that read like some unspoken fantasy. It didn't just feel inappropriate, it felt calculated, deliberate, as if she'd crafted each clip to evoke a specific reaction. And judging by the views, it had worked. My husband's face, his expressions, his movements, all turned into some kind of weird fan service for a bunch of strangers online. It was one thing to imagine her having a crush on him, that was unsettling enough. But for her to create content out of him, to share it with thousands of people who didn't know him, didn't respect him, people who saw him only as an attractive guy on their screen, was something else entirely. The realization made my stomach turn. I couldn't help but feel protective of him, like he was the unwitting target of someone else's twisted imagination. And yet, it didn't stop there. The clip of him working on Raya, his own patient, was the worst of it all. How could June not see the line she was crossing? A child's face, shown to hundreds of thousands of strangers. I could only imagine how Raya's parents would react if they saw it. With a deep breath, I sent the link to my husband. I didn't try to explain it. Didn't add any comments. I knew he'd understand the implications as soon as he saw it. The video, in all its disturbing clarity, spoke for itself. The response came almost instantly. His first text was a simple, "What the hell is this?" followed by a string of angry emojis that almost made me laugh in spite of the situation. He was always good at adding humor when things got tense. But there was nothing remotely funny about this. I could picture him fuming, running his hand through his hair in that agitated way he did when he was upset. I could tell from his texts that he was horrified, just as I'd been. He asked me to come over to his office after hours so we could talk. As I drove there, my mind raced with questions. I wondered what he'd want to do next. If he'd be as shaken by this as I was. But mostly, I kept thinking about how June could betray us so deeply. Her decision to film him without permission didn't just betray me. It violated the privacy of her own sister and put my husband's entire practice at risk. When I arrived at his office, he was already waiting for me, his face tight with anger. He didn't say much, just motioned for me to come in. And we sat down in his small, quiet office. "I just don't understand how she thought this was okay," he muttered, shaking his head. We both sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything settling over us. I could feel the anger radiating off him. But underneath it, I sensed something else, discomfort. Unease. My husband had always been confident and at ease with people. But this had clearly shaken him. The idea that someone had been recording him, framing him for their own social media engagement, had left him feeling vulnerable, exposed. "What if she does it again?" he asked, his voice low. "What if she keeps posting stuff like this? I can't have my face all over the internet, especially not while I'm working with patients. And Raya, her family could sue us. This could ruin everything." His words hit hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. It was more than just a betrayal, it was a serious violation of trust that could have lasting consequences. My mind raced with scenarios, with every possible way this could spiral out of control. I tried to reassure him, to tell him that we could handle this. But I could feel my own anxiety creeping in, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Together, we decided he'd confront June directly, texting her to remove the video immediately and delete any other recordings she had of him. I thought he might wait until morning, give himself some time to cool down. But he pulled out his phone and started typing right then and there, each word coming out in angry, deliberate taps. The text was firm but calm, explaining that he wasn't comfortable being recorded without permission, especially in a professional setting. He made it clear that if she didn't take the video down and delete any other footage, he'd have to involve his practice, maybe even the authorities. June's response was almost instant, and it was nothing like we'd expected. First, she pretended not to understand. "Oh, you mean that TikTok?" she replied, as if it were no big deal. Just a casual video among friends. She claimed she hadn't realized it would bother him, that it was all just for fun. She even threw in a half-hearted, "Sorry if it made you uncomfortable." But the apology felt hollow, empty, and then, without missing a beat, she shifted the blame back onto us. "You guys don't understand," she wrote, her words dripping with condescension. "TikToks with hot guys go viral fast. And it was just a way to get some engagement. It's just how social media works. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." The words felt like a slap. My husband's discomfort, his boundaries, even his professional reputation, none of it mattered to her. To June, he was just content, a means to get likes and followers, a pawn in her pursuit of engagement. She didn't seem to understand, or care, about the impact this had on us. Her focus was on the views, the followers, the validation that came from strangers online. And the worst part? She seemed genuinely baffled that we didn't see it the same way. But that wasn't the end of it. The conversation escalated quickly, her messages becoming increasingly defensive. She accused us of overreacting, claimed we were trying to sabotage her success. In one particularly bold text, she said, "You're just jealous that my content is getting attention. You've never supported me, And now that I'm finally getting somewhere, you're trying to tear me down. My husband and I exchanged a look of utter disbelief. It was as if she'd twisted the entire situation in her head, framing herself as the victim in some bizarre narrative where we were the villains trying to stifle her career. The sheer audacity of it left us both speechless. And for a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. But my husband wasn't one to back down. He repeated his request, this time more firmly, telling her that if she didn't comply, we'd have no choice but to take further action. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. A final line drawn in the sand. And from the tension in his voice, I knew he meant every word. By the time we left his office that night, June had stopped responding, leaving us in a tense silence that felt almost worse than the argument itself. We didn't know if she'd comply, if she'd finally see reason and take the video down, or if she'd dig her heels in and escalate things further. All we knew was that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the days that followed, my husband and I tried to move on, but the incident had left a lasting impact on both of us. He'd check his phone obsessively, waiting for updates, while I found myself avoiding social media altogether, fearing what else I might find. And as the weight of June's betrayal settled over us, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about a video, or even our privacy. It was about trust, about the quiet, unspoken agreements that form the foundation of any friendship. And once that trust is broken, there's no going back. I knew then that our friendship with June had changed forever. And a part of me wondered if it would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, my husband's reaction grew from initial horror to a simmering anger that rarely left him. He's typically calm, not one to lose his temper. But the whole ordeal seemed to unsettle him in a way I hadn't anticipated. I knew the incident had affected him deeply when he started avoiding social gatherings altogether, hesitant to see our mutual friends in case June had spread her side of the story. He'd lie awake some nights, staring up at the ceiling, silent but tense. When I asked what he was thinking, he'd just say, "I feel so violated." I felt the same, but I didn't know what to do. June's career move, as she called it, had stolen the ease from our daily lives. My husband's practice had received the video takedown request, but with TikTok's inconsistent review process, it was still visible. Meanwhile, June had gone quiet, as if waiting to see how far we'd actually take things. Her silence was almost mocking. One night, after another restless evening, my husband decided he'd had enough. "I'm calling her," he said, his voice low but resolute. He dialed June's number, putting the call on speaker so we could both listen. June picked up almost immediately, her tone upbeat, as if nothing were wrong. "Hey, what's up?" she chirped, sounding bizarrely cheerful. There was a long silence. My husband's hand tightened on the phone, his knuckles turning white. "June," he said slowly, "why did you post that video?" A pause. Then she laughed. A soft, dismissive chuckle. "It's just a TikTok. No big deal. Why are you so worked up about it?" His jaw clenched. "No big deal?" he echoed. "You filmed me without my knowledge. At my job. With a patient in the shot. That's a massive breach of privacy." June sighed, as if he were the one being unreasonable. "Look, people like those kinds of videos. It's what's popular. And you're being so dramatic. It's harmless. And besides, the kid doesn't care. Raya doesn't even have social media." I could feel the tension building in my husband. "It's not about social media, June," he said, his voice tight. "It's about basic respect. You didn't just post a funny video. You posted a compilation of private moments without our consent. Do you have any idea how invasive that is?" June's response was a long sigh, full of exasperation. "You're both blowing this out of proportion. You don't get how hard it is to gain followers, to keep engagement up. I finally had a video go viral. And now you're trying to ruin it. Do you know how many opportunities this could open up for me?" My husband's patience had clearly worn thin. "June, this isn't about followers or engagement," he snapped. "It's about our privacy, our boundaries. I need you to take that video down and delete any footage you have of me. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to escalate this." There was a pause, then a cold laugh on the other end. "Escalate? she said mockingly. How? You can't prove I posted anything with bad intentions. This is just content, like everyone else posts. If anything, you should be flattered people think you're attractive. I could see the frustration on his face. The helpless anger of not being able to get through to someone who was so utterly indifferent to his perspective. Finally, he took a deep breath. June, we're done. Do what you want. But don't expect us to stay friends after this. He hung up, and for a moment, we just sat there in silence. I could feel the hurt radiating from him. A deep sense of betrayal that went beyond words. Losing a friend is always painful. But to lose one because of something as trivial as online engagement was almost surreal. How could June be so casual about something that felt so personal? But my husband's practice didn't see it as trivial. They were concerned, not only because of the exposure of his private life but also because of Raya, a minor, being featured without parental consent. They sent a formal notice to Raya's parents, explaining what had happened and recommending that June not accompany her sister to future appointments. It was a difficult decision, one my husband had agonized over, but he knew it was necessary to protect himself and his patients. Raya's parents responded with shock and apologies. They were horrified, both by June's actions and by how little they'd known about her social media activities. They offered to accompany Raya themselves from then on, assuring us that they didn't hold my husband responsible and would support him if he needed further documentation for the platform's review process. When my husband shared their response with me, I felt a small wave of relief. At least Raya's parents were on our side, understanding that this wasn't some petty argument or overreaction. It was a genuine violation, and their support reinforced that we'd done the right thing by speaking up. But despite the backing of his practice and Raya's parents, the situation still gnawed at us. We spent hours discussing it, dissecting every detail, trying to understand how a close friend could disregard our feelings so completely. I feel like I've been blindsided, my husband said one night, staring at the ceiling. How could I not have seen this side of her? I didn't have an answer. June's behavior had been so unexpected, so foreign to everything I thought I knew about her. And the worst part was, her actions were affecting more than just our peace of mind. My husband started taking fewer appointments, citing the need to lay low until the video issue was completely resolved. Even though the video had been flagged multiple times, it still hadn't been fully removed, and his worry about potential backlash continued to weigh on him. And that's when June decided to send me a message. It was late, close to midnight, when my phone buzzed with a long text from her. She started off by accusing me of jealousy, saying I couldn't handle seeing her get attention while I lived in the shadows. She claimed I'd always been secretly resentful of her confidence and that this was my opportunity to tear her down. Then she launched into a tirade about how I'd ruined her chance at success by getting our friends and family to report her content. It was the most manipulative thing I'd ever read, and I felt a strange mix of anger and disbelief as I scrolled through her message. She twisted every detail, painting herself as the misunderstood artist, the victim of our oppressive boundaries. And by the time I reached the end, I realized something. June didn't just misunderstand our concerns, she fundamentally didn't care. I took a deep breath, considering how to respond, and finally typed out my reply. You're delusional and unhinged. You're not successful, and you'll never be. Stay away from us, you creepy weirdo. It wasn't the nicest thing to say, but I meant every word. For 2 years, I'd allowed her quirks, her obsession with social media, and her small-time influencer habits to slide. I'd ignored the signs, brushed off the red flags, all because I valued our friendship. But now, I saw her for what she truly was, someone who would use anyone, even her friends, to boost her own ego. Her response was predictably dramatic. She didn't text back but instead took to her social media, posting vague captions about toxic friendships and how words can hurt more than actions. She even posted a few old photos of us together, tagging me with passive-aggressive comments like, missing the good times before people show their true colors. It was exhausting, and I could feel the anger brewing inside me with each new post. Each thinly veiled attempt to frame herself as the victim. Mutual friends started reaching out, some expressing support, others confused by the situation. A few even hinted that I might have been too harsh, and that June's actions weren't that bad. It was frustrating, feeling like I had to defend myself repeatedly, explaining that it wasn't about a single TikTok video but a pattern of behavior. A betrayal of trust. But for all the backlash, there was a small glimmer of hope. Raya's parents were grateful for my husband's professionalism, and his practice reassured him they had his back. It was a reminder that not everyone saw June's narrative, that there were people who understood the gravity of her actions. In the end, I realized that my decision to call her out, to name her behavior for what it wasn't just about my husband's privacy. It was about reclaiming our sense of safety, our boundaries, and putting an end to her overreach. And as difficult as it was to lose a friend, I knew we'd made the right choice. But in the quiet moments, I still felt the sting of her betrayal, the ache of knowing that someone I'd trusted could so easily dismiss my boundaries. June's silence, her absence, should have felt like peace. Instead, it left a haunting reminder of the cost of misplaced trust. After my response to June, calling her a creepy weirdo, the fallout was immediate and relentless. June wasted no time in crafting her own version of events, painting herself as the wounded friend who'd been unfairly judged and attacked over a harmless video. Her online presence quickly became a platform for her to rally sympathy, posting vague references to cruelty, jealousy, and the need for mental health awareness. She portrayed herself as the victim of toxic friends, of people who didn't understand her creative expression. And to my utter disbelief, she was getting support. She posted one selfie with red, teary eyes, captioned with something like, "Sometimes the people you trust the most hurt you the deepest," followed by hashtags like #mentalhealthawareness and #choose-kindness. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The comments poured in, people offering sympathy, validation, and encouragement, all for June. Her friends, some of whom I'd known for as long as I'd known her, were rallying behind her, expressing anger at how people could be so cold and unsupportive. Watching it all play out left me with an unfamiliar feeling, a mix of anger, frustration, and helplessness. I knew the truth. My husband knew the truth. And so did the people who were closest to the situation, like Raya's parents. But to everyone else, I was simply a villain in June's story. An unsupportive friend who had, for whatever reason, turned on her and cast her aside. The manipulation was breathtakingly brazen. June hadn't just twisted the story, she had built a brand around it. She positioned herself as the tragically misunderstood, small-time influencer, fighting against a world that didn't appreciate her creativity. And for a while, it seemed to work. Our mutual friends started reaching out. Some of them hesitant, others more assertive, expressing concern over what they were hearing from her. A couple of friends asked why I had been so harsh, implying that perhaps I'd overreacted. They'd say things like, "It's just social media, couldn't you have just talked it out?" It was exhausting to explain myself over and over, to justify why I felt violated, why June's actions were more than just a misunderstanding. I wanted to scream, to shake them, to make them see how manipulative and invasive her behavior truly was. But each explanation felt hollow, like I was missing some key way to convey the depths of betrayal. The uncomfortable, slimy feeling of being watched, documented, without my knowledge or consent. One evening, I received a long message from a mutual friend. "Lisa, she's always been diplomatic, the kind of person who doesn't take sides easily." And I could tell she was trying to be delicate. Her message began with an apology for reaching out and saying she didn't want to upset me. Then she went on to explain that she'd been talking with June and had listened to her side of the story. Lisa admitted she'd initially felt sympathy for June, who had been portraying herself as misunderstood and heartbroken, but said she wanted to hear my side directly from me. It was the first time anyone had really asked, and I found myself unloading every detail I'd been bottling up. I told her about the video, the invasion of privacy, the way June had dismissed my husband's discomfort and reduced him to a tool for engagement. I explained how Raya's parents had been notified, how June's actions could have put my husband's practice at risk. I even mentioned the hundreds of secret photos and videos June's boyfriend had found on her laptop. The disturbing catalog of our lives she'd built over months, maybe even years. There was a long pause after I sent the message. And for a while, I thought maybe Lisa had simply decided to side with June. But then her response came. Short but supportive. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize it was this serious. I'm here for you if you need to talk. It was a small validation. But in that moment, it felt monumental. Lisa had seen through June's act. Had taken the time to listen to my side. And it gave me hope that maybe others would too. But as days went on, I realized that not everyone was as willing to see the truth. June's narrative spread among our circle, and several friends pulled away, unwilling to choose sides but still treating me with a cool distance that spoke volumes. June's influence lingered over every interaction, her pity party casting a shadow over my own reputation. It was isolating, maddening, and deeply unsettling to realize how easily someone could rewrite history with a few well-chosen words and a handful of pitying Instagram posts. In the meantime, I tried to focus on protecting my husband's peace of mind. He'd been affected more than I'd anticipated, more than he'd let on at first. He started dreading his workdays, feeling hyper-aware of his surroundings, wondering if other patients or acquaintances might be secretly filming him. 2. I knew it was irrational. But I also knew it was a valid response to what had happened. June's actions had shaken his sense of safety, his belief that he could go about his life without constantly looking over his shoulder. As weeks passed, my husband's practice took more formal steps. They reinforced their privacy policy, adding stricter guidelines for anyone accompanying a minor patient. Raya's family continued to be supportive, and Raya's parents even reached out with another apology, offering to help in any way they could. The support from his practice and from Raya's family was a small comfort. A reminder that we weren't alone in seeing June's actions as a violation. But I could tell that the scars ran deeper than I'd expected. Then one day, my brother texted me with another update. He'd been monitoring June's TikTok account on our behalf. And to our surprise, she'd posted a new video. But it wasn't the kind we'd expected. It was a tearful monologue about how she'd been misunderstood. How her friends had turned on her and ruined her career. She accused certain people of reporting her content out of jealousy and claimed that she'd been forced to take a break from social media due to the emotional toll. The comments were full of sympathy. Stay strong, girl, one person wrote. People who can't handle your success are just insecure. Another wrote, real friends wouldn't do this to you. You deserve better. The list of sympathetic replies went on. And I couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. She'd successfully reframed the narrative yet again, morphing herself into a tragic figure, a victim of her own kindness and innocent ambition. But what surprised me the most was my own reaction. For the first time, I didn't feel the usual surge of anger or frustration. Instead, I felt a profound sense of exhaustion. I was tired of fighting, tired of explaining myself, tired of justifying why I needed to protect my own peace. June could keep her narrative, keep the pity, the followers, the validation. I didn't care anymore. I began to understand that the only way to move forward was to detach myself from her, from the opinions of those who sided with her, and from the need to be understood by everyone around me. It was painful to accept, but I realized that some friendships, even ones that had once felt so close, were simply not worth the emotional toll. So I let go. I stopped checking her account, stopped listening to the murmurs of our mutual friends, and focused on what truly mattered: my husband, my family, and the friends who had stood by me without question. The process was slow, but with each day, I felt lighter, freer. The anger faded, replaced by a quiet resolve. Months later, I still felt the occasional pang of sadness, a faint echo of what had once been a close friendship. But I no longer felt regret. June had made her choice, and I had made mine. And while I couldn't control the story she told, I could control my own, building it around people who respected my boundaries and valued me for who I truly was. In the end, June's drama had taught me a powerful lesson, one I would carry with me long after the dust had settled. Sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is let go of people who don't respect your peace. no matter how much you once cared for them. In the weeks following my final message to June, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the lingering effects of the whole ordeal cast a shadow over everything. Despite the boundaries I'd established, my reputation among our mutual friends had taken a hit. The ones who had taken June's side continued to treat me with polite distance. Their skepticism toward me almost palpable whenever we interacted. And while I told myself their opinions didn't matter, it was hard not to feel isolated. The most exhausting part of it all was navigating the social aftermath. Every event, every casual gathering was laced with an uncomfortable tension. Like everyone was tiptoeing around the subject. Some friends tried to avoid the topic entirely, while others would bring it up subtly, their eyes flickering with curiosity, wanting to know my side of things, but never quite asking outright. It was exhausting, knowing that for so many, this incident had become my defining characteristic, as if the entire history of my friendship with June had boiled down to this one fractured story. One evening, at a small dinner with friends, it came up again. Lisa, the friend who had reached out to me initially and who'd been my main source of support, offered a gentle nudge in my defense, explaining how complex the situation really was. It's not fair to assume things about someone's life when you don't know the whole story, she said, her tone calm but firm. I appreciated her willingness to defend me, but her words only stirred more questions among our friends, who seemed both interested and uncomfortable, unsure of which side to take. As the evening wound down, one friend, Emily, pulled me aside, her expression hesitant. I know this has been tough for you, she said, her voice soft, but maybe, just maybe, you could have given June the benefit of the doubt. I mean, she's struggling too. It's possible she didn't mean to hurt you. You know? I felt a pang of frustration, a sense of disbelief that she could still see June as the victim in all this. But I forced myself to stay calm, taking a deep breath before replying. I understand what you're saying, I said carefully, keeping my voice steady, but what June did was a real violation of our privacy. I tried to explain that to her, but she brushed it off, dismissed our feelings. This isn't about a misunderstanding. It's about her lack of respect for boundaries. Emily nodded, her expression still unsure, but she didn't push the issue further. Instead, she offered a half-hearted smile and a quick hug before slipping away to join the others. As I watched her walk back to our friends, I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. These were people I'd shared years with. People who had been there for birthdays, weddings, hard times, and yet, one incident, one single fracture, was enough to make them question who I was. The hardest part, though, was seeing how much the whole thing had impacted my husband. The sense of exposure, of being betrayed, had struck him deeply. He'd become more guarded, less willing to let people in, and the easygoing confidence he'd once carried had been replaced by a cautiousness I hadn't seen before. He even started taking a few extra precautions at work, double-checking his surroundings, and occasionally asking a nurse or assistant to monitor the room when he was with patients, just in case someone decided to take photos or videos without his knowledge. Watching him navigate these changes broke my heart, and there was nothing I could say to take away his discomfort. The very thing he'd loved most about his job, connecting with patients, creating a welcoming, relaxed environment, had been tainted by June's actions. He'd been kind to her, treated her as a friend, and she'd exploited that kindness for her own benefit, and no amount of reassurance from me could undo that. In an attempt to rebuild some of our peace, my husband and I planned a quiet weekend getaway, hoping a change of scenery might help us put the ordeal behind us. We chose a small cabin by the lake, far from the usual social circles, where we could unwind and focus on each other. The weekend was peaceful, and for the first time in months, we felt truly disconnected from the drama, free to simply be ourselves without the weight of June's betrayal hanging over us. One night, as we sat on the cabin porch, watching the stars flicker above, my husband turned to me, his expression serious. You know, he said slowly, I've realized something through all of this. I looked at him, waiting, feeling the weight of his words even before he spoke. I've always prided myself on being open, on treating everyone with respect. He continued, But this situation made me realize that not everyone deserves that level of trust. Some people, they take advantage of it. Of kindness. His words hung in the air. A quiet revelation that felt both empowering and bittersweet. It was a lesson neither of us had wanted to learn. But it was one we couldn't ignore. We had given trust freely. Naively. And June had taken advantage of that. Twisting it for her own gain. In that moment, I understood that protecting ourselves didn't make us unkind or untrusting. It simply made us wiser. More discerning. As we packed up to leave the cabin, I felt a renewed sense of strength. I wasn't angry anymore, not with June. Not with the friends who had questioned me. Instead, I felt a quiet resilience. A knowledge that I could move forward. That I could carry this experience with me without letting it define me. It was a scar, yes. But it was also a reminder of my strength. Of my ability to stand firm in my boundaries even when others didn't understand. Back home, I continued to distance myself from the social media gossip and the friends who had aligned themselves with June. I realized that while it was painful to lose those connections, I couldn't let their judgment weigh me down. Their opinions didn't define me. Nor did they reflect the truth of who I was. I focused instead on the relationships that had proven their loyalty. The people who had stood by me. Like Lisa. And a few other friends who had shown quiet support. With them, I found a sense of validation. A reassurance that I wasn't alone in my values or my boundaries. Slowly, my social circle began to reshape. Defined not by old loyalties but by genuine respect and understanding. The months passed. And while the memory of June and her betrayal remained, it no longer haunted me the way it once had. I'd moved on. Built a life that was richer, healthier, and more grounded in the people who truly mattered. And while there were moments of regret, fleeting thoughts of what could have been, I no longer felt the anger or bitterness that had once consumed me. Looking back, I saw June's actions for what they were. A mirror held up to my life. Forcing me to confront the importance of boundaries, of self-respect. Her betrayal had been a painful lesson. But it had also been a gift. A catalyst for growth that I wouldn't have achieved otherwise. I had come out stronger, more resilient, and more certain of the people I wanted by my side. In the end, I realized that sometimes, the hardest lessons come from the people we once called friends. And as much as it hurt, I was grateful for the strength I'd found in letting go. Several months had passed, and while I'd come to terms with the whole ordeal, my husband and I were still wary of what might come next. I'd blocked June. Disconnected from her online presence, and moved forward with a stronger, smaller circle of friends who respected our boundaries. Life was getting back on track, and the bruises left by her betrayal were slowly healing. But one day, an unexpected text from June's now ex-boyfriend brought everything rushing back. He hadn't been in touch since their breakup, and I'd assumed he was as eager to leave the drama behind as we were. But his message was short, direct, and unsettling. He asked if we could meet, saying he had something important to discuss about June. I hesitated, not sure if I wanted to dive back into that world of tension and mistrust. But his insistence made me reconsider. And I finally agreed. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe. A familiar place where my husband and I felt comfortable. As we sat across from June's ex, I could see the discomfort in his eyes. He looked worn, as if he, too, had been carrying the weight of June's actions long after their relationship ended. I wanted to reach out earlier. He began, his voice low, but I needed to process everything myself. It took me some time to realize just how far she'd taken things. After we split up, I started going through my old laptop that she used to borrow, and that's when I found them. He looked down, almost as if he was ashamed. I found folders. Multiple folders of photos and videos she'd taken without you or anyone else knowing. There were so many photos of your husband, candid shots. Some from our double dates. Others just random moments that she'd clearly captured without permission. And then there were pictures of you too, photos taken at weird, unflattering angles. Almost like she was trying to make you look bad. Hearing him say those words sent a shiver down my spine. My husband and I exchanged a look of shock. Our faces mirroring the same mixture of disbelief and disgust. I could feel the color draining from my cheeks as I tried to process what he was saying. Hundreds of photos? Videos? This wasn't just a casual crush or an attempt to boost her social media following. This was something far darker. June's ex continued, his hands twisting nervously. I confronted her before we broke up. She admitted she was inspired by your husband's looks for her content, and that the photos of you were just, I don't know, a way to make herself feel better? She said it was for laughs. To have some fun. To prove a point or something. But I think it was more than that. She had an entire album dedicated to photos of you two. My husband's face was a study in anger and disbelief. This isn't just content for social media. This is obsession. And it's incredibly invasive. His voice was calm, but I could sense the tension beneath his words. It all felt surreal, like something out of a bad thriller movie. I'd known June to be quirky, self-centered, sometimes oblivious to other people's feelings. But this crossed lines I hadn't even known existed. She had invaded our lives, taken private moments, and turned them into something sick, something twisted. And to think she'd kept these photos and videos for her own use. Her own strange sense of validation sent a fresh wave of anger through me. June's ex sighed, his expression one of deep regret. I'm really sorry. I didn't know the extent of it until I saw those files. I feel like I should have seen the signs. Should have stopped her somehow. But, well, here we are. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what this revelation meant. I felt violated. Exposed, as if my privacy had been shattered in a way that I could never fully reclaim. And the worst part was knowing that June had gotten away with it. That she'd collected these moments of our lives without a second thought. Storing them like trophies in some sick gallery of her own making. What did you do with the files? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He met my gaze, his expression filled with sympathy. I deleted everything I found. All the photos. Videos, any trace of it, but, he hesitated, his voice wavering. I can't be sure if she has other copies. She was careful about hiding things. She had passwords on her phone. Her external hard drive. I only found what was on my laptop. The thought of June having other copies, other ways of accessing those private moments, filled me with a sense of helplessness. There was no way to know for sure if she'd kept additional files. And the idea of her still holding onto pieces of our lives felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words. My husband's hand found mine under the table. A small, grounding gesture that reminded me I wasn't alone in this. But the unease lingered, an uncomfortable awareness that June's fixation had gone far beyond anything we could have imagined. Eventually, June's ex excused himself, offering one last apology before leaving us alone. As he walked away, I could see the burden he carried. A shared weight of regret and guilt that he, too, was struggling to let go. I knew he'd been affected by her actions just as much as we had. And for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy for him. He'd been caught up in her world, just like we had, manipulated by her need for attention and validation. My husband and I sat in silence for a while after he left. Both of us lost in thought. There was so much to process, so much to unpack, and the implications of June's actions seemed to expand with each passing moment. But as we left the cafe, a sense of resolve settled over me. I was done letting June control my emotions. Done letting her intrusions define my life. When we got home, we decided to take one final step to protect ourselves. My husband contacted a lawyer, someone who specialized in privacy rights, to see what options we had moving forward. The consultation was brief but eye-opening, as the lawyer explained our rights and the steps we could take if June's behavior continued. It was comforting to know we had legal recourse, that we could take action if June crossed any more lines. And while it didn't erase the sense of violation we'd experienced, it gave us a renewed sense of control, a feeling that we weren't completely powerless. As the weeks passed, I focused on moving forward, on reclaiming my sense of peace and privacy. I threw myself into work, spent more time with my husband, and doubled down on the friendships that had proven their loyalty. The scars from June's betrayal were still there, but they began to fade, replaced by a resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. In the end, I knew I'd never truly forget what June had done, the way she'd crossed boundaries and violated our trust. But I also knew that her actions no longer had power over me. I'd learned to set boundaries, to protect myself from people who didn't respect them, and to value the people who truly cared for me. Looking back, I saw June's actions as a painful lesson, a reminder of the importance of discernment, of choosing friends wisely. And while the experience had left its mark, I was grateful for the strength I'd found in myself, the courage to stand up for my privacy, my peace, and my own sense of self-worth. And as I let go of the last remnants of anger, I realized something profound. I'd emerged from the ordeal not just as a survivor, but as someone who knew her own worth, someone who would never let anyone else take advantage of her trust again. The consultation with the lawyer gave us a clearer sense of our options. But it didn't make the situation any less unsettling. As empowering as it was to have legal support, the realization that we might need to take things that far left a knot of anxiety in my stomach. June hadn't reached out since our confrontation, but her silence felt ominous. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air, leaving behind a shadow that lingered over our lives. My husband's anxiety grew with each passing day. He'd always been the more relaxed one between us, the one who shrugged things off and kept me calm when I got worked up. But now, it was as if our roles had reversed. Every time his phone buzzed with a new notification, his shoulders would tense. He'd check his surroundings with quick glances, a habit I'd never seen in him before, especially at work. The violation he'd experienced had shaken him to his core, and it hurt to see him this way. We'd gone over what the lawyer had said, laying out our options like a checklist. The lawyer had mentioned the possibility of a restraining order, explaining that we had grounds given the extent of June's obsession. But taking that step felt both drastic and surreal. We'd been friends with her. We'd shared dinners, vacations, celebrations, and now we were contemplating filing a restraining order against her? It felt like stepping into a nightmare that kept twisting in ways I hadn't imagined. But every time I hesitated, every time I thought about giving her the benefit of the doubt, I'd remember the folder of photos and videos June's ex had found. The images of my husband. The strange, unflattering pictures of me. There was no innocent explanation for any of it. This wasn't the kind of behavior you could overlook. Not anymore. And as much as I hated the idea, I knew that setting legal boundaries might be the only way to feel safe again. My husband and I talked it over repeatedly, each conversation ending the same way, with a mix of reluctance and resolve. It feels like overkill, he'd say, but then he'd shake his head, as if convincing himself. But I can't keep looking over my shoulder, wondering if she's going to pull something else. I felt the same way. The restraining order wasn't just about keeping her away physically, it was about reclaiming our peace. About drawing a line that couldn't be crossed. It was a way to tell her, once and for all, that her actions were unacceptable, that we weren't willing to be part of whatever narrative she was crafting in her head. As we prepared the necessary paperwork, I felt an odd sense of detachment, like I was watching someone else go through the motions. I never thought I'd be in a situation like this, navigating legal channels to protect myself from someone who had once been a friend. I tried to remind myself that I was doing what was necessary, that I was standing up for my husband and myself. But the sadness lingered, the sorrow of knowing that friendship, trust, and kindness could be twisted into something so dark. My husband was more practical about it. This is about safety, he'd remind me, as if I needed the encouragement. This isn't personal. We just can't keep letting her invade our lives like this. And he was right. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that the restraining order wasn't a punishment or a declaration of war. It was a boundary. A necessary, firm boundary that put our well-being first. I wasn't being cruel or overreacting. I was simply protecting my peace, my family's peace, in a way that didn't leave room for misinterpretation. When we finally filed the paperwork, a small wave of relief washed over me. It wasn't the end, not by any means, but it felt like we'd taken a step in the right direction. A step toward reclaiming the sense of security June had stolen from us. But as much as I wanted to close that chapter, as much as I wanted to believe that this would be the end of it, the fear still lingered. There was no guarantee she would respect the order. No guarantee that she'd simply let us go. The lawyer advised us to be vigilant. to document anything suspicious or alarming, and to report any contact she might attempt. The idea of staying on guard, of being hyper-aware of every interaction, was exhausting, but I knew it was necessary. June's actions had shown that she was willing to disregard boundaries, to ignore our comfort for the sake of her own gain, and I couldn't afford to take that lightly. Over the next few weeks, the anxiety remained a constant undercurrent in my daily life. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, checking my phone for any signs of June's online activity. She hadn't reached out, but her silence didn't bring the comfort I'd hoped for. Instead, it felt like the calm before a storm, a quiet lull that left me waiting, wondering when, or if, she'd strike again. My husband and I leaned on each other more than ever, finding strength in the routines that anchored us, in the small rituals that reminded us of our life before June's betrayal. We spent more time at home, finding comfort in the familiar spaces that felt safe, protected, and though we still carried the weight of what had happened, we slowly began to reclaim our peace, one day at a time. But just as we started to feel a sense of normalcy, my brother called with unexpected news. He'd kept an eye on June's online presence for us, monitoring her accounts for any signs of retaliation or escalation. He told me she'd been posting more frequently, her captions filled with cryptic messages about lost friendships and trust issues. One post, in particular, caught his attention. It was a black and white photo, artsy and abstract, but undeniably pointed. The caption read, "Some people will never understand the price of true success. You'll lose friends. You'll face betrayal. But real power means never letting anyone hold you back." Reading those words felt like a slap. It was as if she was taunting us, reminding us that she had her own version of the truth, one she'd continue to peddle to anyone willing to listen. But this time, I didn't feel the same anger or frustration that had gripped me before. I felt something different, pity. June was clinging to a version of herself, a persona that depended on manipulating others, on casting herself as the victim. And as unsettling as it was, I realized that she would never let go of that narrative. Not for us. Not for anyone. That was the turning point for me. In that moment, I understood that June's obsession, her fixation on control, wasn't something I could change or reason with. It was part of who she was. Part of a deeper need that no friendship, no relationship could fulfill. And as much as it hurt, as much as it had cost us, I finally felt ready to let her go completely, to release the hold her actions had over me. In the days that followed, I stopped checking her account, stopped asking my brother for updates. The restraining order was in place, and I trusted that we'd done everything we could to protect ourselves. I focused instead on rebuilding, on nurturing the friendships and relationships that truly mattered, the ones that brought peace rather than pain. I knew there would always be a small part of me that felt the sting of June's betrayal, the sadness of losing a friendship I had once cherished. But I also knew that I was stronger, wiser, more resilient because of it. I had faced the darkness, navigated the storm, and come out on the other side with a deeper understanding of myself, of the boundaries I needed to protect my peace. And as the days turned into weeks, as the weight of the past began to fade, I found myself filled with a quiet sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons I'd learned, for the strength I'd found, for the people who had stood by me when everything else had fallen apart. I was no longer haunted by June's actions or her silence. Instead, I was free to move forward, to build a life grounded in trust, in respect, in the unwavering belief that I deserved peace. In the end, June had taken a piece of my past, a part of my story, but she hadn't taken my future, and that was a power she would never hold over me again. As time passed, I slowly regained my sense of balance, but the effects of June's actions lingered like a faint bruise that wouldn't quite fade. Her intrusion into our lives, her disregard for our boundaries, and the pain of her betrayal left an indelible mark, not just on me and my husband but on our relationships with others as well. The story of what had happened spread quietly through our social circles, whispered about in half-understood fragments that twisted each time they were repeated. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, and the divide it created among our friends and family only added to the complexity. It wasn't long before family members weighed in, 2. My mother, always one to prioritize keeping the peace, had caught wind of the situation through family friends. She called one evening, her voice gentle but concerned, trying to understand why I'd felt the need to cut ties so harshly with June. Wasn't there a way to settle things quietly? She asked, sounding genuinely puzzled. To her, filing a restraining order against someone who had once been a friend felt excessive. An overreaction that could have been handled more diplomatically. For a moment, I felt that familiar tug of doubt. That instinct to explain myself. To smooth things over for her sake. But then I remembered everything we'd been through. The anxiety, the invasion of privacy, the files of secret photos and videos. There was nothing quiet or diplomatic about June's actions. And I knew I couldn't let my mother's lack of understanding sway me. Mom, I said softly but firmly, there are things she did that you don't know about. Things that went far beyond what you might think. This wasn't just a petty argument. She crossed lines that can't be uncrossed. My mother sighed, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I just don't want this to eat away at you. She was your friend once. Wasn't she? It's such a shame to lose that. I understood where she was coming from. I'd felt that shame myself. The sadness of losing a friendship I'd once valued. But I also knew that holding on to people who hurt you doesn't bring peace. It only delays healing. So I reassured her as best I could, emphasizing that my husband and I were finally starting to feel safe again. That our decision was about protecting ourselves, not holding on to bitterness. In some ways, my mother's reaction mirrored that of some friends, well-meaning, but uninformed. They couldn't fully grasp the depth of what June had done because they hadn't experienced it firsthand. To them, it was simply a falling out. A sad story of former friends who couldn't make amends. But to me, to my husband, it was a violation. A wake-up call about the lengths some people would go to for their own validation. Despite the tension, I was grateful to my mother for listening. For at least trying to understand. Not everyone in my family was as supportive. A few relatives took June's side. Perhaps because her online posts painted a more sympathetic picture. Or perhaps because they couldn't reconcile the idea of nice, sweet June with someone capable of such obsession. They urged me to forgive and forget, insisting that I was letting a minor issue ruin relationships. But I stood my ground, politely explaining that while forgiveness was possible, trust was something June had shattered beyond repair. One particularly difficult conversation was with my cousin, Sarah, who had known June almost as long as I had. Sarah believed that I should have forgiven June's overzealous behavior and moved on, saying that I was creating drama where none was necessary. You know how social media can be addictive for people, she argued, as if June's actions could be chalked up to a simple lapse in judgment. It's not like she physically hurt you. Her words stung, not because I agreed with them, but because they revealed how little she understood. This wasn't about a fleeting mistake. It was about boundaries, respect, the right to live without fear of being watched and catalogued by someone who'd crossed the line between friendship and fixation. I wanted to make Sarah see that this wasn't about drama, it was about dignity. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. It's not about physical harm, Sarah, I replied. It's about emotional harm, about being treated like a piece of content for someone else's gain. She didn't just break my trust. She ignored every boundary I set. This isn't something that can be fixed with a simple apology. Sarah nodded, though I could tell she was still unconvinced. And while it hurt to know that some family members might never fully understand, I reminded myself that this decision wasn't for them. It was for me and my husband. For our well-being and peace of mind. Surprisingly, as time went on, the restraining order became a source of clarity. It was a firm, tangible boundary. One that gave us a sense of security we hadn't felt in months. And while the rest of the world might not have fully understood our reasons, we knew we had done what was necessary. In the end, it was less about punishing June and more about reclaiming our lives. About drawing a line that couldn't be crossed. As the legal process unfolded, my husband and I focused on rebuilding, on nurturing the relationships that had shown unwavering support. Lisa remained one of my closest friends. Her loyalty a constant reminder that true friends respect boundaries and never make you question your worth. We spent more time with the people who had stood by us, letting go of the ones who had chosen judgment over understanding. The conversations with family and friends weren't easy, and sometimes I'd catch myself second-guessing our actions, wondering if we could have handled things differently. But each time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself of the discomfort, the fear, the loss of trust that June's actions had brought. And in those moments, I knew we had made the right choice. One day, as I was sorting through old photos, I found a picture of June and me from one of our early outings. We were smiling, carefree, and I could almost feel the warmth of that moment. A snapshot of a friendship that had once felt genuine. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sadness, a nostalgic ache for the connection we'd once shared. But as I looked closer, the sadness faded, replaced by a sense of acceptance. I'd loved that version of June, the friend who laughed with me, supported me, and shared life's little joys. But that person didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had. And while the memories would always be a part of my story, they no longer held power over me. I'd let go, not out of anger or resentment, but out of a quiet understanding that some people are meant to be chapters, not fixtures, in our lives. In the end, the restraining order, the lost friendships, and the family disagreements all served as reminders of my own strength. I had faced a betrayal that had once felt insurmountable, and I'd come out the other side with a clearer sense of who I was, of the values I refused to compromise. Moving forward, I knew that I'd carry these lessons with me, not as scars, but as reminders of my resilience, of the boundaries I was willing to defend for the sake of my own peace. June had taken pieces of my trust, of my comfort, but she hadn't taken my strength. And that strength, I realized, was something she could never touch, no matter how many lines she crossed. In the end, I was grateful, not for the betrayal, but for the clarity it had brought, the friendships it had solidified, and the wisdom I'd gained along the way. I'd learned to let go of the need for validation, for approval from those who would never fully understand. And as I moved forward, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that I'd emerged from this chapter with my self-respect intact, my heart a little wiser, and my boundaries firmly in place. The months that followed were filled with quiet changes, shifts that were almost imperceptible but deeply significant. The pain from June's betrayal had softened, no longer a sharp wound but a dull reminder of a hard lesson learned. Life moved on, reshaping itself around the gaps her actions had left. And gradually, I began to feel like myself again, stronger and more grounded in who I was and the values I held. June's silence had continued, and with the restraining order in place, I felt the welcome absence of her presence. It was a strange comfort, knowing that legal boundaries now protected me from further intrusion. I stopped watching over my shoulder, stopped checking to see if her online presence had revived with new cryptic messages. Instead, I reclaimed my energy, redirecting it toward things that genuinely mattered. One of the biggest shifts was in my relationship with my husband. The ordeal had tested us, revealing vulnerabilities neither of us had known we had. I'd watched him navigate his own discomfort, his sense of exposure, and his shaken confidence. But through it all, we found ourselves leaning on each other, finding solace in shared resilience. The experience had deepened our connection, reminding us both of what it meant to protect and support one another. We'd faced something dark together, and in the process, we'd learned to hold each other even closer. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, my husband turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "I know it's been a mess," he said softly, "but I'm proud of how we handled it. I'm proud of you, especially. You never backed down, not even when people questioned you." His words touched me deeply, validating the months of struggle, the effort to hold firm against judgment and misunderstanding. In that moment, I realized how far we'd come, not just as individuals, but as partners. We'd confronted the shadows together, and emerged stronger, more united than before. With the support of true friends, I found myself reconnecting with life in a way that felt both new and familiar. Lisa remained a constant source of positivity and understanding, and other friends who had stood by us continued to bring light into our lives. I began to cherish these relationships more than ever, grateful for the loyalty and trust that had withstood the test of June's betrayal. Yet, even as the months went on, there were still moments when I'd reflect on what had happened, on the friendship that had once brought so much joy. I couldn't erase the memories completely, nor did I want to. June had once been a friend, a person I'd trusted, laughed with, and shared countless moments. And while the pain of her actions would always be a part of our story, I chose to see it as a reminder of what happens when boundaries are ignored, and of the importance of trusting my instincts. But I no longer carried anger or bitterness toward her. Instead, I felt a strange kind of peace, an acceptance that some people enter our lives for reasons we may never fully understand. June had shown me a side of friendship that I hadn't known existed. One that required constant vigilance, boundaries, and, ultimately, a willingness to let go. As time passed, I noticed subtle changes in myself. In the way I approached friendships and interactions, I became more discerning, more protective of my inner circle. I no longer felt the need to seek approval or validation from people who didn't respect my values or boundaries. Instead, I focused on nurturing the connections that uplifted me, the people who saw me for who I truly was. I began to invest more time in my passions, throwing myself into projects I'd put off for too long. I volunteered, took up new hobbies, and rediscovered old interests that had once brought me joy. These small but meaningful actions reminded me that life was still rich and full, that I was capable of growth and healing, even in the aftermath of betrayal. Eventually, I reached a point where I could think about June without feeling the weight of her actions pressing down on me. She was simply a part of my past, a chapter in my story that I had closed with a sense of resolution. I no longer needed to understand her motives or seek closure from her directly. I had found my own closure, my own resilience, and that was more than enough. One day, I found myself scrolling through old photos, memories of happy times with friends and family. I stumbled upon a picture from one of our double dates with June. A snapshot from a time when things had felt carefree and uncomplicated. In the photo, we were laughing, our faces lit up with joy, unaware of what was to come. For a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia, a reminder of the good that had once existed. But I didn't dwell on it. I let the memory be, acknowledging it without letting it consume me. June was a part of my journey, but she no longer held power over my present. I was free to remember without pain, to move forward without looking back. As I put the photo away, I felt a quiet sense of pride, a recognition of the strength I'd found within myself. June's actions had tested me, had pushed me to my limits, but they had also taught me the value of self-respect, of drawing firm lines and standing by them. I knew now that I was capable of protecting my peace, of choosing friendships that were built on mutual respect and trust. In the end, I didn't need June's approval, nor did I need validation from those who hadn't understood. I had created my own peace, my own version of closure. I had chosen resilience over resentment, growth over anger, and as I looked toward the future, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for the pain, but for the lessons it had brought. Life would continue, with its inevitable challenges and joys. But I was ready for whatever came next. I knew who I was, what I valued, and the boundaries I needed to protect. And as I moved forward, I carried with me a newfound strength, a quiet resilience that had emerged from the shadows, shining brightly in the light of a hard-won peace. The journey through this chapter of my life, with all its unexpected twists and painful revelations, ultimately led me to a place of strength and clarity I hadn't known before. The struggle of reclaiming my peace and setting boundaries became a turning point that reshaped my priorities, my relationships, and my sense of self. The weight of June's actions and the judgments from others no longer felt heavy on my shoulders. Instead, they served as a reminder of the values I held close, a compass guiding me toward the friendships and connections that truly mattered. With time, the fears and anxieties that had once dominated my thoughts began to fade. I could feel myself letting go of the hurt, not through forgetting, but through accepting it as part of my past, part of my growth. And while it was true that the trust I had once given so freely was now more measured, more cautious, it felt like a wise adjustment, a recognition of the importance of choosing the right people to let into my life. My husband and I found ourselves stronger than before, bound by the shared experience of navigating this challenge together. We had faced uncertainty, betrayal, and judgment, yet our relationship had emerged more resilient and grounded. We'd weathered the storm together, and it made the quiet moments we shared feel all the more valuable. In the calm, I felt a renewed appreciation for the partnership we'd built, one rooted in mutual respect, open communication, and unwavering support. The friendships that endured became precious. As well, those who had believed in us, who had stood by us without hesitation, had shown their true colors. In them, I found loyalty, understanding, and kindness, the foundations of genuine companionship. I no longer needed a large circle to feel fulfilled. The few who stood by me with unshakable support were more than enough. They taught me that the right people would never make me question my worth or my choices, they'd only lift me up, encouraging me to stay true to myself. One afternoon, as I walked through the park with my husband, the sun warm on my face, I felt a peace that had eluded me for so long. I realized I was ready to leave this chapter behind, to let the memories of June and the pain of her betrayal rest in the past. She had been part of my journey, a part that had taught me invaluable lessons, and while her impact had been profound, it no longer defined me. I had taken back my life, redefined it on my terms, and surrounded myself with people who valued the same peace and respect that I did. As I looked toward the future, I felt a quiet thrill. This new chapter was mine to write, filled with endless possibilities, untainted by the shadows of the past. And with each step forward, I carried a deep sense of gratitude, not for the hardship, but for the strength it had uncovered within me. I had chosen resilience over resentment, integrity over insecurity, and peace over conflict. In the end, I knew this. Life would continue to offer its challenges. But I was ready. I was stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected to those who mattered most. I had learned the value of boundaries, the power of self-respect, and the courage to move forward without looking back. And as I embraced this new chapter, I knew that I was finally, truly free.